The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet countryside, casting a golden glow across the fields as Jack stepped onto his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His days always began early, the routine of tending to his land offering him a kind of peace he had grown to appreciate in his solitude. He was a man of few words, known by the locals as the quiet farmer who kept to himself. Life hadn't been particularly kind to him. Years of hard labor and heartbreak had shaped a man who found more comfort in the soil than in people. As he scanned the edge of his property, his eyes caught something unusual near the fence that separated his land from his neighbors. A section of it was sagging, the wood splintered and weak, clearly damaged in the recent windstorm. With a quiet sigh, Jack set his cup down and pulled on his worn gloves. The fence wasn't technically his responsibility, it stood on the boundary between his land and Alina's, the notoriously irritable woman who lived alone just beyond the tree line. She was sharp-tongued, quick-tempered, and had made it clear over the years that she didn't want his help or his company. But Jack wasn't the kind of man who let things fall apart when he could fix them. Whether she liked it or not, the broken fence posed a problem for both their properties, and he wasn't about to wait for her to notice it. He loaded his toolbox into his old pickup and drove the short distance to the broken section. The morning was still and quiet, save for the chirping of birds and the crunch of his boots on the gravel. As he began inspecting the damage, he felt eyes on him, but saw no one. Shrugging it off, he knelt by the fence, unaware that behind the half-drawn curtains of the farmhouse nearby, Alina stood silently watching him. Her expression unreadable, she narrowed her eyes, torn between annoyance and something she couldn't quite name. Just as Jack was tightening a loose board with a rusted nail, he heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. He didn't look up right away, focusing instead on driving the nail into the wood with a steady rhythm. But the voice that followed stopped him mid-swing. "What do you think you're doing?" Alina's sharp tone cut through the morning air like a knife. She stood on the edge of her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, wearing an oversized sweater and worn jeans. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her eyes were fixed on him with suspicion. "You're on my land." Jack stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans before turning to face her. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. "The fence is damaged. I figured I'd fix it before livestock starts wandering. I didn't ask you to," she snapped, taking a few steps forward. "This isn't your business, and I don't need your charity." Jack tilted his head slightly, unfazed by her anger. "It's not charity. It's common sense. The fence keeps your property safe too." She opened her mouth to argue, but something about the quiet certainty in his voice made her pause. There was no arrogance in his tone, no patronizing smile. He wasn't trying to one-up her or play the hero. He was just helping. Still, old habits died hard. "I don't want anyone thinking I can't handle things on my own," she said more quietly, almost to herself. "I don't think that," Jack replied, his voice low and even. "But you don't always have to do everything alone." Alina blinked, her lips pressing into a tight line. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, vulnerability, or maybe surprise, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the house, muttering under her breath, "Do what you want." Jack watched her go, then turned back to the fence. He didn't expect thanks. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He just believed that when something was broken, it was worth fixing, even if the person on the other side of it didn't think she needed anyone. The door creaked shut behind her with a heavy thud, echoing through the quiet house like a sigh. Alina stood in the hallway for a moment, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Jack's words lingered in her mind, "You don't always have to do everything alone." She hated how they stirred something deep within her, something she'd buried long ago beneath layers of bitterness and guarded silence. With a frustrated shake of her head, she kicked off her boots and walked into the dimly lit living room. Dust motes floated lazily in the slivers of light slipping through the blinds, and the old wooden floors creaked beneath her feet. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a collection of picture frames, some turned face down, others left untouched since she first moved in. Her eyes were drawn, as always, to the largest frame in the center. Inside was a faded photograph of a man and a woman dressed in elegant formalwear, standing in front of a sprawling estate. They were her parents, smiling for the cameras, beaming with pride and prestige. Alina walked over and picked up the photo, tracing her finger along its edge. She hadn't seen them in years, not since she'd rejected their life of high society, scandal, and fake smiles. She had grown up in a world of gold-plated lies, where status mattered more than sincerity, and every gesture came with strings attached. Her family owned one of the largest financial empires in the country. She was the only heir. But instead of embracing the legacy they had prepared for her, she had run away from it, choosing this quiet, ordinary life far from city lights and gossip columns. People in the nearby town knew little about her past. They only saw the cold, reclusive woman who snapped at strangers and kept her gates locked. That was by design. It was safer that way. Safer to be seen as difficult than vulnerable. Easier to be left alone than risk being known and hurt. But Jack had always been different. He didn't ask questions. He never pried. And even though their interactions were brief and often tense, there was something in his silence that felt genuine. Something in the way he looked at her, not with curiosity or judgment, but with quiet respect. That scared her more than she'd ever admit. She set the photo back down and wrapped her arms around herself. Her heart was heavier than usual today, not just because of the past, but because of the present, because a quiet, kind-hearted farmer was outside fixing her fence without being asked, and despite everything she'd told herself, a part of her wished she could walk back out and join him. The next morning, Jack was back at the fence, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled up, and sweat already forming at his brow despite the early hour. The damage had been worse than he'd thought. More than a few posts were rotting at the base, and several planks needed replacing entirely. Still, he worked steadily, undeterred by the sun or the silence. He wasn't doing this for anyone's approval. That had never been his way. Fixing things with his hands came naturally to him. It was honest, simple work, and it gave him purpose. From behind her living room curtains, Elena watched him again. She told herself it was just curiosity. But as the minutes turned into hours, she couldn't stop glancing out the window. He worked with a quiet focus, not rushing, not complaining, never once looking back toward her house as if expecting praise. Most people she'd known, especially the ones from her old life, only helped if they could hold it over you later. Jack didn't seem to be that kind of man. That unsettled her more than it should have. By noon, the sun had risen high and hot. Jack took a break, sitting in the shade beneath a tree near the fence. He reached into his toolbox for a water bottle but found it empty. He didn't complain, just leaned back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes for a moment. That was when the screen door creaked open behind him. He didn't turn around, but he heard the hesitant footsteps, softer than yesterday's, and then the quiet clink of something being set down. When he looked up, a mason jar filled with iced lemonade sat on the edge of the fence, a clean cloth tucked underneath it. There was no note, no explanation, and no sign of Elena. He stared at it for a moment, then smiled faintly. Without a word, he picked up the jar and took a sip. It was tart, a little sweet, and ice cold, perfect. It tasted like a peace offering, though he didn't expect one. The next day, a sandwich appeared, wrapped in wax paper and placed carefully beside his tools. The day after that, a slice of fresh pie. She never brought them out while he was watching, and she never said a word about it. But her silence had shifted, less guarded, more curious. Something was changing, slow and quiet as spring soil. Jack never brought it up, didn't make a fuss. He simply smiled to himself each time he found her offerings. He sensed that she was reaching out in the only way she knew how, through small gestures, half-hidden kindness. And he accepted it, not just with gratitude, but with patience. Elena, for her part, didn't know why she kept doing it. She told herself it was just politeness, just being neighborly. But the truth was, she liked seeing him out there. She liked the steady rhythm of his work, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he never once asked anything of her. And somewhere, deep down, she liked the feeling that maybe, just maybe, someone was willing to fix the things she'd given up on, without expecting her to pretend she was whole. The sky darkened quickly that afternoon, shifting from pale blue to an ominous gray that rolled over the hills like a warning. Jack looked up from the fence, sensing the change in the air. The wind had picked up, cool and restless, tugging at his shirt as the first low rumble of thunder growled in the distance. He glanced at the fence, still unfinished, and sighed. He hated leaving work half done, but the storm wouldn't wait. Across the field, Elena stood on her porch, her arms folded tightly as she watched the clouds gather. Storms always unsettled her, not because she feared the rain or thunder, but because they reminded her of how fragile everything could be. One bad storm, one wrong move, and everything she'd worked to build, to protect, could come crashing down. As the first drops began to fall, she turned to go inside. But something stopped her. She spotted Jack, still moving quickly along the side of his barn, trying to secure loose tarps and push equipment under shelter. The wind had grown stronger, throwing dust into the air and bending the trees sideways. Rain began falling in thick sheets, and visibility dropped instantly. Without thinking, Elena threw on a raincoat, pulled up her hood, and rushed outside. By the time she reached him, Jack was fighting against the wind, trying to keep the barn door shut. It slammed wildly against the frame, threatening to break off its hinges. Without a word, Elena grabbed the other side and pushed with all her strength. Together, drenched and breathless, they managed to pull it shut and bolt it. They stood there for a moment, shoulders heaving, rain pouring down around them. Jack turned to her, stunned. "You didn't have to come out here," he said over the sound of the wind. "I know," she replied, brushing wet hair from her face. "But you looked like you could use a hand." Their eyes met, and for the first time, the space between them didn't feel so heavy. Jack gave her a small, surprised smile. "Thanks." She shrugged, but her lips curved up, just slightly. "You'd do the same." Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a crash of thunder that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. Without thinking, Jack reached for her arm, guiding her toward the barn. Inside, it was dark but dry. The sound of the storm outside felt muffled, like a distant world. They sat on overturned crates, water dripping from their clothes, their breathing slowly evening out. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The storm outside roared, but inside the barn, there was an unfamiliar calm, born not of silence, but of shared effort, of standing side by side when things got tough. Elena looked over at him, his soaked hair falling over his forehead, his hands resting on his knees. She saw something in him that she'd always resisted acknowledging, strength that wasn't loud, kindness that asked for nothing, and a kind of honesty she hadn't known she was starved for. "I didn't expect you to say thank you," she said softly. "I didn't expect you to help," he replied. Their smiles met in the quiet, and though the rain continued to pour, something else had already begun to settle between them, unspoken, delicate, and quietly real. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and fields that glistened with fresh rain. Puddles pooled along the dirt path, and the air smelled of wet earth and something softer, like the possibility of something new. Jack resumed his work at the fence, but his thoughts kept drifting to the night before. Elena's sudden appearance in the rain, her hands pushing against the barn door beside his, the shared silence as the storm raged outside. It had shifted something inside him. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt it deep in his chest. Meanwhile, Elena stood in her kitchen, staring at a dish towel twisted in her hands. She had barely slept, haunted not by fear or regret, but by the unfamiliar warmth she'd felt sitting beside Jack in the barn. That moment, however brief, had unraveled something carefully wound inside her. She had always prided herself on needing no one, on keeping people at arm's length. But last night, when he looked at her like she was more than the bitter woman everyone assumed she was, something inside her cracked open. By midday, she had made up her mind. It took her nearly an hour to work up the nerve, but finally, she opened her front door and stepped onto the porch. Jack was already packing up his tools when she called out, "Hey, Jack." He turned around, surprised not by the sound of her voice but by its softness. "I made dinner," she said, trying to sound casual, though her hands betrayed her nerves. "I mean, as a thank you. For the fence, and the barn, and everything." Jack blinked, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You sure?" She nodded, almost embarrassed. "Just come by around 7, if you're free." He hesitated only a second, then offered one of his rare smiles. "I'll be there." That evening, just as the sun began to set, Jack arrived, clean-shaven, hair-combed, wearing a plaid shirt that didn't have a single grease stain on it. Elena met him at the door, her cheeks flushed with more than just the warmth from the kitchen. The house smelled of roasted vegetables and baked bread. She had lit a few candles, though she pretended it was just for light. They ate at a small table near the window, and for the first time, the silence between them felt easy, even comfortable. Elena, usually guarded, found herself laughing at one of Jack's dry jokes. Jack, usually reserved, listened intently as she spoke about her greenhouse, her stubborn hens, and the way she secretly loved thunderstorms. Somewhere between the second bite and the final sip of tea, she paused, searching his face. "You don't ask questions, you know. Not like most people." Jack looked at her, thoughtful. "Most people ask because they want a story to tell. I don't need to know everything to care." Her breath caught for a moment. No one had ever said something like that to her. Not without wanting something in return. She looked down at her hands. "There's more to me than what people think." "I know," Jack said simply. In that small kitchen, under the soft flicker of candlelight and the quiet hum of crickets outside, something delicate took root between them. Not a declaration, not a confession, just a shared truth, that maybe, for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt quite so alone. It was a few days after the dinner when the envelope arrived, thick, cream-colored, and embossed with a gold seal that shimmered faintly in the light. It sat in Alina's mailbox like it didn't belong there, out of place among the usual utility bills and farm supply catalogs. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, her fingers tightening around its edges. The return address was instantly familiar, a Manhattan estate office with her family name printed below it in fine, expensive ink. She closed the mailbox, glancing instinctively toward the fields. Jack was working again, as usual, his steady rhythm a comfort she had grown used to. Her pulse quickened. She shoved the letter into her coat pocket and walked quickly back to the house, hoping he hadn't seen. But Jack had noticed. Not the letter, he wouldn't snoop, but the way she'd suddenly stiffened, how her pace had changed. Something was off. Later that afternoon, he knocked lightly on her door. Elena opened it, surprised but not annoyed. Jack rarely initiated conversation unless he had a reason. He held up a small metal piece. "Found this near the edge of the fence. Looks like it came from your gate." "Oh, thanks." She took it, but her voice was distracted. She stepped aside. "You want to come in?" He hesitated only a second. "Sure." Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of coffee and something faintly floral. The envelope now sat on the edge of the counter, partially hidden beneath a stack of napkins. But Jack noticed the corner of the gold seal peeking out. He didn't mention it. Instead, they sat in silence for a moment, until Elena let out a shaky breath. "There's something I should probably tell you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I haven't exactly been honest. Not because I meant to lie, but because hiding just felt easier." Jack's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. He waited. She reached for the envelope and placed it between them. "My name isn't just Elena. It's Elena Whitford. My family, they own Whitford Holdings. Maybe you've heard of it." He nodded slowly. "The investment group. Yes. My father built it. I was raised with everything, money, expectations, pressure. I was supposed to take over the company after him. But I didn't want that life. I didn't want the lies, the media, the constant pretending." "So you walked away?" he asked gently. "I disappeared. Changed my last name. Bought this land quietly with cash from an inheritance and started over. People thought I was crazy. Maybe I was." She gave a bitter little laugh. "Everyone saw me as this spoiled, stubborn girl who threw it all away. But I just wanted something real." Jack was quiet for a moment, letting her words settle. "And this," he gestured toward the letter, "means they're trying to pull you back." "They always are," she admitted. "There's always another offer, another plea. I usually ignore them. But I thought, if you found out who I really was, you might look at me differently." Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees, meeting her gaze fully. "Elena, I don't care about your name. Or your past. I care about the person who ran through a storm to help me save my barn. The one who left lemonade and pie without expecting a thank you. The one who talks to her chickens when she thinks no one's listening." Her eyes shimmered, but she held herself still. "I see you," Jack continued. "And nothing about that changes because of some last name or bank account." For the first time in a long while, Elena felt seen, not as the daughter of a wealthy family, not as the cold woman next door, but as herself. And in Jack's steady voice, she found something she'd forgotten she was still searching for: acceptance without conditions. The days that followed passed more gently than either of them expected. The tension that had once clung to their interactions like a second skin had begun to loosen, replaced by something softer, more uncertain, but more honest. Jack still worked on the fence, even though it was already fixed. He found excuses to tighten bolts or recheck posts, and Elena didn't question it. She started lingering outside longer, sitting on the porch with her coffee, watching him work, offering occasional sarcastic remarks that made him chuckle in that low, quiet way she'd come to appreciate. But underneath the ease, a question lingered between them, unspoken, suspended like mist in morning light. What now? One evening, just as the sun dipped below the hills and bathed the fields in a golden-orange hue, Jack set his tools down and walked toward her porch. Elena sat with her legs tucked beneath her, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. He didn't wait for an invitation this time. He climbed the steps and sat beside her, silent for a moment as the cicadas began to hum. Finally, he spoke. "Are you going back?" His voice was quiet, steady. No judgment, just curiosity. She stared ahead at the horizon, the clouds tinted pink. "I don't know. A part of me feels like I should. Like I owe them something. But another part of me, the bigger part, doesn't want that life." He nodded, his hands folded in his lap. "I think you already left it a long time ago." She looked at him then, really looked, at the lines on his face, the calluses on his hands, the calm in his eyes. "You didn't treat me any differently. Even after I told you the truth. I didn't need to. You're still you." That quiet truth hit her harder than she expected. Her throat tightened. "I used to believe love came with conditions. Status. Appearances. And then I met you. And nothing about you ever asked me to be anyone but myself." Jack smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips. "I've admired you for a long time, Elena. Even when you were throwing glares like daggers across the field." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and light. "I was a nightmare. You were hurting," he said simply. "But you were still brave enough to start over." A silence settled again, but it wasn't awkward. It was full, complete, like two pieces that had finally clicked into place. Jack turned slightly, his voice softer now. "I want to build more than fences," he said. "With you. If you'll let me." Tears welled up in her eyes, not the kind born from sadness, but from the release of years of fear and hiding. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, surprised by how natural it felt. "I'd like that," she whispered. They sat there as the sky turned navy and the stars appeared, one by one. In the field below, the fence stood tall and mended, once a barrier, now a symbol of something built with care. Something that held. Something that could last. And as the night deepened around them, Jack and Elena remained on the porch, two quiet hearts, finally ready to begin again, together.